Okay, I'll mute myself.
We should. And I just want to mention, for those of you who have been to all the programs, I think that in every session, every program, there's been at least one reference to the other topics. And this was not completely by design. It's just sort of happening. Because as I've created the soup for this month with all the different ingredients, there's some overlap and some interconnectivity between the different topics, between Hasidic tales, greatest tales of all time, the sessions on Professor Wiesel's life and legacy, and conflict. Somehow there are surprising connections, and so I encourage you to try to identify those as we go, or maybe think back and review your notes and see if you find connections. So I have an ongoing conversation with a friend and teacher of mine whom Martha knows, named Professor Steve Esposito at Boston University. Steve Esposito is a wonderful person, a great teacher, and a classicist. He's a professor of classics. He teaches Greek and Latin, and his area of focus is Greek tragedy. And he co-taught with Professor Wiesel sometimes at Boston University. He's a super duper mensch. And he has a theory that in comparing Greek and Jewish cultures, Greek and Hebrew cultures, the Greeks had what he calls a tragic outlook, and the Jews had an anti-tragic outlook, because the Jews always have God as kind of a seatbelt, as a backup, so that even when things get difficult, ultimately we don't believe in a tragic universe. Ultimately, Jews are optimistic and believe that there's meaning behind the apparent tragedies that appear in the world. And I've argued with him over years about this, because I believe that having God in the picture makes things actually more difficult sometimes, and sometimes more tragic. And when we have to ask questions about why bad things happen to good people, and we wonder why God allows these things to happen, it's more difficult and perhaps more tragic, or at least more a source of conflict and inner conflict and wrestling. And so we've gone back and forth about this. And as we've had this conversation, he said, well, can you bring some examples of a Jewish tragedy, of Jewish stories that really are tragic? So what I want to look at today in the context of stories about conflict is one of the more important stories, fairly well-known stories from the Talmud about conflict that went wrong. It's a tragic story. And what we're going to see is the story itself, which is very sad, but then perhaps the redemption of that tragedy in future Jewish commentary, the way that rabbis and thinkers later on used this story to teach a critical lesson about conflict and controversy and machloket, which is the Hebrew word for disagreement, a difference of opinion, and how to not only manage or navigate differences of opinion, but how to really celebrate differences of opinion and harness the power of differences in order to generate a more truthful, more dynamic, more open and honest, flexible and evolving worldview. So that's what we're going to see today. I'm going to share my screen with you. And we're going to explore the tragedy and redemption, perhaps. And redemption is in parentheses for a reason, of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So I hope you can all see this. You may have seen this story before. We're going to look at some later commentaries that you probably have not seen before. And it begins like this. One day, Rabbi Yochanan was a first generation Amora. And Amora is a rabbi of the Talmud. So we're talking about the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries of the Common Era. The rabbis in the land of Israel or in Babylonia are called Amoraim. And they are the rabbis of the Talmudic period. And Rabbi Yochanan is a rabbi in Israel, not in Babylonia. And he's really acknowledged as the greatest rabbi of his time in the land of Israel in the first generation of the Talmud. One day, Rabbi Yochanan was bathing in the Jordan River. Reish Lakish saw him and jumped into the Jordan, pursuing him. At that time, Reish Lakish was the leader of a band of marauders. So Reish Lakish means literally the head of Lakish. Lakish was sort of his last name, or perhaps it was his father's name. His actual name was Rabbi Shimon, or became Rabbi Shimon, as we'll see. It was Simon, the son of Lakish, but his nickname was Reish Lakish, the head of Lakish. And he's the head, the leader of a group of bandits, of highwaymen, of robbers, of tough guys. They have a gang, and they're involved with gang violence in the land of Israel in the early Talmudic period. And Reish Lakish sees Rabbi Yochanan bathing in the river, and Reish Lakish jumped into the Jordan River, pursuing him. He's going to hold him up. This is a stick-up. Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, "Your strength for Torah," in the original Aramaic, "Chelcha leoraita." Your strength should be used for Torah, because he saw this powerful leap of the bandit king, Reish Lakish, who jumped into the water, and he jumped like the Incredible Hulk, a huge jump. And Rabbi Yochanan was impressed and said, "You should use that strength for Torah." Reish Lakish said to him, "You're a good-looking guy. You should use your beauty for women. We could go out carousing together." Rabbi Yochanan said to him, "If you return to a life of Torah, if you renounce your ways as a bandit, I will give you my sister in marriage, who is even more beautiful than I am." Immediately, we should have a question here, because according to Jewish law, you cannot offer a woman in marriage without her permission. So the commentators add or try to fill in here, assuming she agrees, which makes us.
There's a request. Sorry, Ariel, there's a request to make the text a little larger, if you can, for people to see it.
Okay, I'm going to stop the share to do that for a second. So Rabbi Yochanan says, while I'm doing this, I'll keep explaining where we are. Rabbi Yochanan says, if you return to a life of Torah, and if you come and study with me, basically, then, assuming she agrees, you can marry my sister, who's even more beautiful than I am. So, what would you do? Would you renounce your successful career as a highwayman, as the leader of all the bandits? Reish Lakish says, okay. And Reish Lakish accepted upon himself to study Torah. And he decided to study Torah. And as soon as he decided that, Reish Lakish was unable to jump back over the river. He had lost his physical strength. As soon as he committed himself to spiritual pursuits, he had lost his physical strength, which is very interesting. Rabbi Yochanan taught Reish Lakish Bible. He taught him Mishnah, the oral tradition, and he turned him into a great man. Meaning, what's a great man? So I have to tell you, there's actually a technical definition of a great man in the Talmud. I just learned this week. A great man in the Talmud, a gavra rabbah in Aramaic, a great man, is somebody who has the intellectual and interpretive skill to interpret things in the Bible or in Torah in order to help people. So the classic example of a great man, the definitional example, is someone who looks at the Bible and sees that the Bible says that if someone does certain things, they get a certain punishment. And a great man is able to interpret the Bible text in such a way that the punishment is not as bad for the person who receives the punishment. In other words, being a great man is two things. It's having the skill and the interpretive methodology to manipulate the Torah. Number two, for the sake of someone else. So Rabbi Yochanan turned Reish Lakish into someone who was able to interpret the text, interpret the Bible, interpret the Mishnah, participate in conversations that we find in the Talmud about all areas of life, all areas of Jewish law. And you find actually in the Talmud that almost every page has a reference to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, usually together, because they are now study partners. They appear together. As we'll see, they disagree often, but they are paired. They are the primary study partnership of that generation. So Reish Lakish becomes a great sage. He's quoted all over the place. And if you study Talmud, you'll see his name often. But one day, and everything I just said about all the references to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish all of that takes place over a period of decades. They studied together over decades. many years of study, many years of debate, many years of conversation on many topics, making up an important stratum of the Talmud over many years. But the text here glosses over those years and skips ahead to the following. One day, the sages of the study hall were engaging in a dispute concerning the following teaching, the following Baraita, which is a teaching from the earlier Mishnaic period, the early rabbinic period, 1st and 2nd centuries. But a Baraita is a text that wasn't incorporated, accepted into the canon of the Mishnah. Baraita literally means an outside text. So it's a secondary outside text from a few generations earlier that deals with Jewish law. And there's a teaching from a Baraita about weapons with regard to the sword, the knife, the dagger, the spear, a hand sickle and a harvest sickle. From when are they susceptible to ritual impurity? Which means, when do they become actual complete vessels? The Baraita continues, it's from the time of their manufacture, when they're created. Now this gets into laws about purity and impurity, which are not relevant to us in a practical sense. In a metaphysical sense, perhaps they still are very practical and very relevant, but in the literal sense of the purity laws of the biblical and early rabbinic period, when we had a temple in Jerusalem and people had to pay attention to various states of purity and impurity, this was a very practical question for them in a way that it's not for us. And it's enough for us now to know that they're arguing about these items, sword, knife, etc., and when they become susceptible to ritual impurity. When do they become complete vessels, complete tools? When can you say that they're done? That's the question. When is the completion of their manufacture? When do you say that a sword is complete? That's the question at stake here. After decades of arguing about things, all kinds of issues, this argument is going to turn out to be catastrophic. Rabbi Yochanan says, it is from when one fires these items in the furnace. Remember, how do you make a sword or any sort of iron or metal implement? You heat up the metal, you melt the metal, heat up the metal, hammer the metal into shape or form it in some other way. And at the end, you fire it in very high heat to strengthen it, and then you dip it in water. That's the way that you form a sword. You've seen a blacksmith or someone creating a tool like this. You heat it up in fire, then you place it in water. Rabbi Yochanan says, from the moment it is fired up in the furnace, it is considered a complete item, a complete tool. Reish Lakish said, no, it is from when one scours them in the water after they have been fired in the furnace. Okay, I know you're all very passionate about these issues of swords and daggers and spears and when they become complete in order to receive the ritual impurity. In our current political climate, all the issues that people talk about, immigration, healthcare, the economy, I noted that none of the political candidates were talking about this issue. No one was talking about when is a sickle, a harvest sickle, complete in order to receive ritual impurity. And like me, you were probably very disturbed by that. In fact, you probably watched the first debates and then the presidential debates, and you were probably waiting for someone to address this pressing, important issue, but it didn't happen. It left a great gap in the political discourse of 2020 and 2021, and we are all wondering what's going to happen with the harvest sickle and the hand sickle. Of course, I'm joking, but somehow, watch what happens to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, and this had never happened before in all the decades of their arguing, Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, a bandit knows about banditry. You know this stuff about weapons because you've used weapons before, because remember you were a bandit in your youth? Remember when you were a highwayman? Reish Lakish said to Rabbi Yochanan, what benefit did you provide me by bringing me close to Torah, by changing my life and inviting me to study with you? There they called me leader. There among the bandits, I was called the leader of the bandits. Rosh Halistim, I was the leader, the head of the bandits. Here they call me leader. This is a mistake in Sepharia, actually. This word should not be bandits. It should be rabbi. They call me leader of the rabbis, or leader of one of the leaders of my generation. So you didn't really do anything for me when you changed my life and encouraged me to leave behind banditry and become a scholar. There I was a leader, here I'm also a leader. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, what do you mean? I provided benefit to you as I brought you close to God. I brought you under the wings of the divine presence, under the wings of the Shekhinah. In other words, they quarreled. It got personal. What started as a conversation about the law, which is seemingly like many other conversations about the law in the Talmud, and also seemingly not the most heated issue, not the highest stakes issue, not the kind of thing that you would imagine a Thanksgiving dinner breaking apart over. Somehow, for them, that's exactly what happened. It got personal. Rabbi Yochanan said, a bandit knows banditry. You know this stuff because you were a bandit. Now, you need to know this is shocking because there's actually a Jewish law that you are not allowed to remind someone who converted to Judaism of their past or someone who becomes religious of their past. You have to be delicate about people's pasts. You don't remind people if they had a period of time where they were involved in things that they might not be so happy about now. You have to be careful about reminding them of those things or mentioning those things in a way that could be embarrassing. And yet the greatest rabbi of the generation, kind of the chief rabbi of the land of Israel in this generation, does just that. And we have to wonder why. Why does it get personal here? Now the story takes a tragic turn. As a result of the quarrel, Rabbi Yochanan was hurt, emotionally hurt, which affected Reish Lakish, who fell ill. Rabbi Yochanan's sister, remember her? The beauty, the great beauty, who apparently agreed to marry Reish Lakish because she's now Reish Lakish's wife, came to her brother Rabbi Yochanan, begging that he pray for Reish Lakish's recovery. She said, do this for the sake of my children. Pray for him that he should recover so that my children should have a father. Rabbi Yochanan said to her the verse, leave your fatherless children. I, meaning God, will take care of them. Meaning it's okay for them to lose their father. Shocking, right? Very harsh, very cold. She said to him, do it for the sake of me, my widowhood. And he continued the verse, let your widows trust in me. Very, very cold and dark. And Reish Lakish died. This is the end of the life of Reish Lakish, one of the greatest sages of the Talmud. And as soon as he died, Rabbi Yochanan was sorely pained over losing his friend and his partner in study. And he was in such pain that his mind was no longer calm. He couldn't concentrate on anything. He fell into a deep depression. And the rabbis, the other rabbis, his colleagues said, who will go to calm Rabbi Yochanan's mind and comfort him over his loss? They said, let Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat go. Let's get him a new partner, a new chavruta, a new study partner, a younger man, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Pedat. As his statements are sharp, he's very clever. He can substitute for Reish Lakish. So now we come to the story, the part of the story that we're going to pick up again later. Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat went and sat before Rabbi Yochanan. And with regard to everything that Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Elazar would say to him, there's a ruling that's taught in a Braita, in an earlier text, that supports your opinion. And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, are you the son of Lakish? Are you anything like my former study partner, Reish Lakish? Every time I studied with Reish Lakish, whenever I would say anything, he would raise 24 difficulties against me in an attempt to disprove my claim. And I would answer him with 24 answers. And the halacha by itself, or the halacha itself, would become broadened and clarified through that process, through the dynamic process of our disagreements. And that was wonderful. And yet you say to me, there's something that supports your opinion. I'm going to bring a proof that you're right. Don't I already know that what I'm saying is good? I already know that I'm right, or I wouldn't be saying it. I want you to challenge me. Reish Lakish challenged me. I miss that. I can't live without that. Rabbi Yochanan went around tearing his clothing, weeping and saying, where are you, son of Lakish? Where are you, son of Lakish? And Rabbi Yochanan grieved until he lost his mind. This sounds like a Greek tragedy. He grieved until he lost his mind, or Shakespearean tragedy. The rabbis prayed and requested for God to have mercy on him, and Rabbi Yochanan died. This is the end of the tragic story of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. It's a tragic story, clearly on its own terms. The breakdown of communication after decades of study together, after decades of disagreement. And there are many questions we have to ask about this story. So I'm going to stop the share for a little bit. Let's consider some of the questions. And then we'll go to a much later commentator who perhaps takes something from this that we can use and perhaps in some sense redeems the story, this tragic story. Some questions. First of all, why did the greatest rabbi of his generation become triggered over what seems to be a topic of discussion that's not any more significant or controversial than any of the hundreds, if not thousands, of other discussions that these two great rabbis are having every single day of their lives since they met? As I said, every page of Talmud, you can open almost any page of Talmud, you'll find Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish arguing about things. They're arguing about the kosher laws, they're arguing about carrying things outside on Shabbat, they're arguing about the sacrifices in the temple, the order of things, they're arguing about how to interpret verses, back and forth and back and forth, lots of argument, lots of disagreement in the way of the Talmud. This is what the Talmud is composed of, and everything is smooth. They disagree strongly, but they hug at the end of the study session. They're close friends. Their families are close. They're brothers-in-law. They eat together. They celebrate together. They have Shabbat dinner together. It's very nice. The next day they go back and study, disagree again, come back for Shabbat lunch. They have some kugel together. They have a l'chaim together. They drink a toast to each other. Everything is wonderful. Everything is very warm. And here suddenly over an issue that isn't even relevant in their time because there's no more temple in their time. Purity laws don't apply in their own time. Suddenly they get so upset and so triggered. Rabbi Yochanan, the great rabbi, gets so triggered over something like this. That's shocking, number one. Number two, how could Rabbi Yochanan be so cruel to his sister and in the face of his sister's pleas? She's begging him to save her husband, and he refuses, quoting a biblical verse in what seems like a very cruel way. What's happening there? And number three, why does Rabbi Yochanan, as soon as Reish Lakish dies, why does Rabbi Yochanan turn and realize, oh my God, I just lost my best friend. I just lost my study partner. If he had realized that 5 minutes earlier, he could have saved Reish Lakish. 5 minutes earlier. And this is Elie Wiesel's definition of a tragedy, is too late. Too late is the definition of tragedy. And that's why we can fairly call this a tragedy, because it's a matter of minutes or perhaps a day. Reish Lakish died because Rabbi Yochanan refused to pray. And as soon as he died, Rabbi Yochanan said, oh yeah, I should have prayed. Too late. It's too late. Terrible. We're not going to answer all of these questions. But one thing I want to point out, sometimes, and this is an important lesson when we think about conflict today, when we think about the kinds of disagreements that we have with people in our lives or in our political discourse more publicly, sometimes it happens that what we are disagreeing about is actually really a cover or a metaphor for something much deeper that is actually more personal. And so if you look at what they're arguing about, it seems like a relatively benign and not particularly relevant matter of Jewish law about purity and impurity. But think about it for a moment. What might they be asking here underneath? Think about this. What might they really be arguing about that's more personal when they talk about the sword, the knife, the dagger? When are they done? When is the completion of their manufacture? And as you think about that, notice that there's a motif in the story that has appeared before. And that motif, of course, is water. They met in the water. Rabbi Yochanan was in the water when they met. Rabbi Reish Lakish jumped over a great area of land in order to enter the water to attack Rabbi Yochanan, and his life changed. He thought he was going to maybe walk away with some money or Rabbi Yochanan's clothing or whatever he could get, and then he could sell it and make some money. And instead he walked away with a new life and a loss. Remember, he lost his strength. So it could be, this is one proposal for understanding the story a little bit better, that what they're really arguing about is Reish Lakish fully cooked? Is Reish Lakish done? Is Reish Lakish complete? Is his process of turning from the head of the bandits to being a great rabbi, complete. And one of the interesting things that you might notice if you're reading very carefully is that Reish Lakish is not called Rabbi Reish Lakish, which implies that he did not receive ordination from his teacher and friend, Rabbi Yochanan. And so it could be that they're arguing by proxy, the proxy of a conversation about knives and daggers and hand sickles and harvest sickles, but they're really arguing about Reish Lakish himself. And Rabbi Yochanan says, the time of completion is the fire. Reish Lakish says, no, the time of completion is the water, and I have been in the water. I have already been in the water. That is a literary psychological reading of this story that is an attempt to explain why here and nowhere else does Rabbi Yochanan take this personally. Why does the conversation devolve into a personal ad hominem attack? A bandit knows about his banditry. That's an attempt. I'm not fully satisfied with this reading, but it's an attempt to understand why they get triggered over something that seems so innocuous. The rest of it, I'm not going to try to answer the questions of Rabbi Yochanan's cruelty and then his quick turn back to compassion and grief, except to say that this is very often very human. And Rabbi Yochanan seems to be like the people who often fall into anger and are in a massive, epic sulk and aren't able to see the consequences of their actions in those moments, and later realize, wait, what were we fighting about? What were we fighting about? Why was that so important? It wasn't so important, actually. And it seems sort of ridiculous that we had a fight about something so small years ago. But I can see that now. I couldn't see that then. I think this is a very human story in this sense. It's still very disturbing, especially because Rabbi Yochanan is considered the greatest rabbi of his generation, and the law follows Rabbi Yochanan, even when he's arguing with other great rabbis, not just Reish Lakish, but some of the other leading rabbis of the land of Israel or Babylonia. The law follows Rabbi Yochanan almost all the time, which means he's an acknowledged master of masters. And yet, in this story, he seems to be as trigger-happy and sulky and cruel as any of us in our worst moments of conflict, of destructive conflict with others. And that's part of what's so disturbing and shocking about the story. But what I want to focus on for the rest of our time is the end of the story, the penultimate stage of the story, when Rabbi Elazar, the new student, the new study partner, is sent to Rabbi Yochanan. And what's wrong with Rabbi Elazar's approach? Remember, he supports everything Rabbi Yochanan says. Now, I just want to ask you for a moment, would you prefer to have someone who is always questioning and challenging you in your life, so that everything you say is challenged all the time by a close friend or partner? Or would you prefer to have someone say, you're awesome, and that makes a lot of sense, and here's an additional reason that what you're saying is so wise and so smart? What would you prefer? I mean, from an ego perspective, certainly we would prefer the latter. I would certainly prefer to be bolstered in my claims, supported constantly. That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful. I would feel more confident. I would feel constantly supported, and I would feel strengthened by that. But the truth is, the result of that could be disastrous. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan says to Rabbi Elazar. If you support me all the time, you're not really contributing anything to me. You're not adding anything to my wisdom. And if I'm really seeking wisdom and not ego, I want someone who's going to challenge me. Now, in order to understand this further, we have to travel several thousand years into the future from the Talmud, from the first generation of rabbis of the Talmud, to one of the great Hasidic masters, the Rebbe of Ishbitz, a Polish Hasidic master, who was the close friend and companion, ironically and very meaningfully, and we're going to talk about this in the class on Hasidic masters next week. We're going to talk about the Rabbi of Kutsk. So here's the connection to another class right here. The Rabbi of Kutsk and the Rabbi of Ishbitz were closest friends and colleagues and companions until they too, like Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, had a tremendous break and a split that would change the destiny of Polish Hasidism. And we'll say more about that next week. But the Rabbi of Ishbitz is one of the more creative, radical thinkers. And here, he is going to help us understand the story more deeply. And in order to do that, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verse 18. Vayomer Hashem Elokim lo tov heyot ha'adam levado. And God, the gods, Hashem Elokim, this is a whole conversation about the names of God here. The Lord God said, and this is right after the creation of Adam, who's now alone in the Garden of Eden, it's not good for the man to be alone. Eselo ezer kenegdo, I will make an ezer kenegdo for him. An ezer kenegdo in Hebrew. Now the English in Sepharia is a fitting helper. But the literal translation of ezer kenegdo is ezer is a helper. Good, we have helper in the English. Kenegdo could be translated as fitting because kenegdo comes from the word neged, which means opposite or aligned or symmetrically opposed. So if you have two paintings and you want to hang them exactly across from each other in the living room, you're going to make sure that they are neged one another. If one is a tiny bit, an inch over to the left, it's going to disturb you. It's bad feng shui. It's going to annoy you when you walk into the room. You want it to be really aligned. In Hebrew, you would say you want them to be neged. But neged also means they're opposed. And so a better translation is, God says, it's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper against him for him. I will make a helper against him. And this is the creation of Eve. Eve is created in the next verse. Now the Rebbe of Ishbitz, writing in the mid-1800s in Poland, says, I will make a helper against him. It is the will of God that help and assistance will blossom from something which is against him. It is the will of God that help and assistance come from something which is against you. What does that mean? This is like the relationship of a student and teacher or study partners, as we find concerning the relationship of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, in which Reish Lakish challenged every statement of Rabbi Yochanan with 24 questions. Because of this, their learning benefited. And this is unlike Rabbi Elazar, who offered teachings in support of Rabbi Yochanan. When a person sees how he or she is being challenged, he or she strengthens his or her ideas with more proofs and supports. And then the ideas, the words go out well, they're refined into the light of day, into the public sphere. So yes, I would prefer to have someone telling me I'm right all the time, but what if I'm wrong? And the person around me is just being a yes man and telling me that I'm right, and then I go out and make a fool of myself in public. What if I'm walking around my house saying, I think the earth is flat, because if you think about it, we don't fall off. And someone in my house, my partner, my friend, my study partner, my student, my teacher is saying, you're right, man. Now here's some proofs. I'm going to bring a bunch of proofs to you that you're right. And then I go out and say that to all of you here at CSP, right? I will be shocked to find that not everyone agrees with me. I will be terribly unprepared to engage with the world with any ideas because they will be undercooked. That's what the Ishbitzer Rebbe is saying about Ezer Kenegdo. And I just want to end before we open up to questions and conversation by reading, I want to read from my book, Witness, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom, because Professor Wiesel talked about this in class. And he talked about it in a very powerful way. So I'm reading from Witness, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom. You've seen this before. And this is from chapter 2, which is about otherness, which is about diversity and difference in Professor Wiesel's classroom and in general. And he says in class, from the beginning, Genesis teaches us how to be human together. This is from a course on the book of Genesis. From the beginning, Genesis teaches us how to be human together. One of the first things we notice in the story of man and woman is the reason given for Eve's creation. The verse tells us that her mission is to be an Ezer Kenegdo, literally a helper against him. Ezer means helper, Kenegdo means against him. Why against him? The rabbinic commentators tell us that this teaches us a model of friendly antagonism. Friendly antagonism, in which in order to support you, I challenge you. My intentions are for the sake of our friendship, so that your thinking is clarified, your ideas refined within the bounds of our conversation. The first couple are also the first friends, the first strangers, the first to encounter an other. What does it mean to disagree for the sake of the other, rather than in order to defeat or silence the other? This, I think, is the redemption of the story of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. It's still a tragedy, and it ends in tragedy. There's no arguing with that. But the lesson of the story, I think, is that it's possible. Rabbi Yochanan learned this too late. This is the tragedy of Rabbi Yochanan. He learned this too late. But the lesson that we can learn from the story, not too late, in time to change our ways of disagreeing with one another in our own private lives and in our public political space, is that we can disagree with one another for the sake of the other. What does it mean to disagree for the sake of the other? What would it look like to get into arguments about things that matter, not in order to score points, not in order to win arguments, but in order to help my conversation partner become wiser, more refined, deeper, even if they're not going to agree with me? What would it look like to welcome 24 challenges? And it's interesting that it's 24, isn't it? That Reish Lakish would bring 24 questions and challenges to Rabbi Yochanan. Why do you think it's 24? It could be because he brought another challenge every hour on the hour of the day, literally or figuratively. It could be. But there might be some other reason. But what would it look like to welcome that and to welcome that openness? Could you imagine public conversations and debates and disagreements in which we have a strong sense of commitment to the other? And I want to end just by saying that this is not always, but this is the best of what happens in traditional Jewish study. I've seen this often in yeshivot and academies of Jewish study, where if you walk into a yeshiva, a house of study, a Beit Midrash, in many places in Israel and elsewhere, if you walk in, you will be accosted by a din, a very loud noise of people arguing with each other. And they are arguing with each other, full force. They are yelling. They are sometimes pounding the table. It looks very dramatic. It looks like people are angry, but they're not. Because when they're done, they embrace or they shake hands or high five, and they have a deep sense of closeness through the conversation and through the argumentation. And that is, in fact, very much the Jewish way of studying. So if I say something that needs to be challenged, I'm begging you to challenge it. I want you to challenge it. And I want people in my life to challenge me and my assumptions, because I want to refine my thinking. Not just so I won't be embarrassed when I go out and make a statement about the earth being flat, but because I really do want wisdom, and I want to notice if I'm misunderstanding the universe in some fundamental way. And this is the lesson that Rabbi Yochanan learned too late in his own life. But the Talmud includes this story, I think, to tell us that we should learn the lesson before it's too late, and we should embrace this style of disagreement. And when we have someone, we find someone who's willing to challenge us from a place of love and commitment in order to help us refine our views, we should really celebrate that. We should really embrace that. And this is one of the classic tales of conflict in Jewish history and Jewish literature. So let's open to your questions. I hope you have 24 questions at least. Ari, over to you.
I think people have been posting, but not the usual number. Maybe they've been taking in the story. We actually studied the story with Rabbi Avi Strasberg recently in a different series, and but I don't think she brought that extra story from the Ishbitzer. So I guess we'll start with some questions. Number one is, okay, I'm looking at this list here. Do you believe stories like this are stories based on real happenings from the rabbis, or are they read back into people's lives for teaching us, giving us a message like we just discussed here? It's just a opening foray.
That's a good meta question about the Talmud and Jewish literature in general. And I think it depends on the story. I think there certainly are stories that are meant to be taken only figuratively, or even perhaps mythologically. So you'll find in the Talmud, you'll find stories of rabbis experiencing phantasmagorical things, I've mentioned this before. There's the stories of the great sage Rabba Bar Chana, who actually is a student of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. We have many statements of Rabba, the son of Bar Chana, in the name of his teacher Rabbi Yochanan, or in the name of his teacher Reish Lakish, which means he studied with both of them, which means that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish shared students, which adds an element to this story. And he has a series of stories that he tells of his journeys, his travels, in which he sees, and I mentioned this example once before, he sees, for example, a frog that's the size of 60 villages. So that story is clearly not meant to be taken literally, at least according to most commentators and even traditional commentators. We have many books that explain what that means on a figurative or mythical level. But then there are stories like this one, and I think if you find a story that isn't radically supernatural, and more importantly, that casts the rabbis as complex and flawed characters, in my view, that has great credibility, because if you were trying to protect the image of your own elite rabbinic community, you would not tell this story. You would not tell the story of the chief rabbi of the land of Israel in the first generation of the Talmud screwing up, forgive me, but screwing up so badly. You just wouldn't tell that story. Just like you wouldn't tell the story of the flaws and foibles of biblical characters, and our Torah includes those stories. There's no perfect leader. There's no perfect person. I think that's really powerful and wonderful. One of the things that I love about our tradition is that our tradition is very upfront about those mistakes, those flaws, including character flaws, including those flaws that end in tragedy. There's no happy ending to this story, except for the fact that all the decades of discussion between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are also included in the Talmud. So we might encounter them on a daily basis before they get to this terrible point. So we have all their teachings. That's wonderful. But if the rabbis are telling this story about Rabbi Yochanan, I'm convinced it's true.
People ask whatever happened to the family of Reish Lakish then, because there was no one there to take care of them.
Very good question, and it's not spoken to in the story itself. The implication might be that they are on their own and that God is somehow taking care of them. That was Rabbi Yochanan's view. What I would like to see in the story, though, is that Rabbi Yochanan comes back to his sister and says, "Oi, was I wrong? I'm going to take care of you guys now." That's not explicit in the story. Maybe that happened, but it's not written in the story itself. We don't know.
Cynthia asks, and other people have kind of commented in their comments to this, can you comment on the homoeroticism in the story between these two figures? And is that, do you think, something that's playing in the background as well?
There is a read of that in the beginning of the story by Daniel Boyarin and others. Mostly Boyarin started this line of thinking, I believe, where instead of Reish Lakish jumping into the water to rob Rabbi Yochanan, he has other things in mind. And Boyarin supports this contention. Actually, it's not exactly homoeroticism, because at least according to Boyarin, if I remember correctly, the Talmud elsewhere says that Rabbi Yochanan is one of the most beautiful of men. The Talmud elsewhere says that Rabbi Yochanan was really unique among the rabbis in that he could not grow a beard. So Boyarin says Reish Lakish probably thought he was a woman bathing in the Jordan. And then he discovers that he's a man, and when he says your beauty for women, he's exclaiming with surprise, "Oh, you're a good-looking guy, but I'm shocked that you're a guy at all. I'm shocked that you're a man at all, because I thought you were a woman." That's one implication and one way of reading the story. Later on, I mean, you could build something more out of this, but it's difficult, because the text, all the other stories we have of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are very similar to the stories of other great rabbis arguing, and especially after Reish Lakish marries Rabbi Yochanan's sister, I think it's a harder interpretation. But that initial story, that initial encounter, certainly could be read that way.
Jeff Kaufman or Mary Craft, because I never know who they post together. They have a question about contemporary yeshiva chavrutas and maybe your experience. And the question is, did you find either you or people around you were arguing about issues like purity of a weapon type things, or did you bring modern questions into your chavruta discussions and debates?
That's a great question, and there's some variation depending on where you're talking about. But in a very traditional yeshiva, a traditional academy of Jewish study, which is where I spend most of my time, what you're studying is whatever is on the page of Talmud, mostly Talmud. Also law, later books of Jewish law, but mostly Talmud. You spend the first 4 hours of the day studying Talmud, and then you come back to Talmud later in the afternoon. In the morning, you go very, very deeply into a short section of Talmud. It could be a couple of lines, and you spend 4 hours on a couple of lines, sometimes on a word, sometimes even on a letter. I've spent 4 hours in a group on a single letter. Why does Rashi, on his commentary on the Talmud, say "and" here, thus linking two concepts that seem to be totally separate and discrete? That's the kind of thing that people will do, and it has implications. So it's not just spinning our wheels. In the afternoon, you study more in a way of covering ground. You're reading quickly, you're reading less deeply. So you have two different ways of studying Talmud. And what you're studying typically is what's on the page. Now, in different academies, in different places, they will emphasize different things. In some places, they will emphasize the simple reading of the text. We want you to understand what's going on the page, and maybe you'll be tested on it. We want you to memorize what's going on the page. We want you to memorize the basic commentator so that you can repeat back what you learned. In other places, they go deeper. They study the commentators and the super commentaries, the commentaries on the commentaries, the early commentators and the later commentators, the Rishonim and the Achronim. And sometimes they will support students to really develop as more creative interpreters of the text themselves. And I got to experience that style of study, which is really glorious because it's deeply empowering, where you are positioned now as a student, as a creator of new understandings of the text, of the Talmud text. And still other places will take it even further. And wherever possible, and I believe fundamentally it's always possible, but sometimes it's very difficult, sometimes it's very easy. Whatever you study, you will bring into relevance to the contemporary moment at some point. So once you understand what's basically going on the page, because you have to do that first, otherwise you're just projecting your own situation onto the page. But once you understand what's happening on the page of Talmud and the commentaries and maybe the super commentaries, then at some point you will start to ask as a natural thing, well, how does this apply to our lives? And within that approach, there are many, many diverse approaches to methodologies for exactly how you do that. Some of them will emphasize more psychological readings or literary readings or political readings, Hasidic readings, Lithuanian readings. But the fundamental thing in many places is you first, what's called you get pshat, meaning you understand the simple reading of the text so that you're not just spinning your wheels. As one of my teachers used to say, we're not studying Ariel Burger right now, we're studying the Talmud or we're studying Maimonides, right? He would say that to different students when we would project our own opinions. You start with the text with great humility, but eventually you get to the conversations about, well, what does this mean for us today? And what does it mean for us today could be a question of how the law evolved from the time of the Talmud through all the generations of study and discussion into the codes of Jewish law that are very practical today in traditional communities. Or it could mean more broadly, what can we learn from this dynamic or this story or this argument about something that seems obscure and obsolete about our contemporary situation? And I'll just say the greatest, in my opinion, the greatest Jewish thinkers are expert at all of that. They're really good at understanding what's on the page with all the attendant commentaries and super commentaries, but they're also very, very good and skilled at bringing it to life and bringing it into dialogue with what's happening today, because that's ultimately what Torah is for. So I think the answer is that that's the ideal, and that's what's really, I think, supposed to happen. It doesn't always happen. It depends where you go.
Elizabeth wants to know where you studied in yeshiva in Israel.
In Israel, I was in several places. I was in Hamivtar, which is Rabbi Dr and Rabbi Riskin's yeshiva. I was there briefly when I started, and then I was at Yakar in Jerusalem, which is a very special place, which wasn't exactly an academy, but I was studying with the rabbi there, Rabbi Mickey Rosen, of blessed memory. And then I was at a small yeshiva called, it was technically called, the official name was Knesset Beit Eliezer. It was known more affectionately as Rabbi Pupko's yeshiva. And Rabbi Pupko of blessed memory was a very iconoclastic thinker and a very creative thinker, out of the box thinker in the very Orthodox world, who would say things like, imitation is the beginning of all impurity. He was a very wise man. And when I was a student there, I had the great privilege of running downstairs to get him a Diet Coke from the makolet, from the grocery store. And he would always say, get it from the back of the fridge so it's colder. That was he was applying his Talmudic precision to the instructions, the mission of getting a Diet Coke for him. And then I studied in Chappelle's for a little less than a year, which is also called Darchei Noam in Jerusalem. And then I was in Bat Ayin, Yeshivat Bat Ayin for 5 years, which is where I had a lot of exposure to not only Talmud study, but Hasidic study and practice, because that's the focus of that yeshiva.
Well, that's a good segue to the next question, which is, would this argument happen in a Hasidic world?
The argument specifically about this ritual matter?
No, if you say Rabbi Yochanan is one of the great rabbis of the Talmud, and so is Reish Lakish, would this type of breakdown ending in 2 deaths happen in the Hasidic world?
Oh, it happened in the Hasidic world. Yeah, there's a whole history of that. In our class on Hasidism, we saw how the opponents of the Hasidim put the Hasidim in excommunication. And then last night, I guess, we talked a little bit about the controversy surrounding Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, which was one example of the internal conflict in the Hasidic world. But sometimes that got really out of hand. And I mentioned yesterday, I wrote my dissertation about sectarian conflict in the Hasidic world, because there's a fascinating history of conflicts that got way out of hand, beyond the story we just read. Not just one-to-one conflict, but group conflicts with violence and turning people into the Russian government and all kinds of ugliness. And then voices of sanity saying, how do we draw on our spiritual practices and tradition to calm this all down? And I was very fascinated by Hasidic nonviolence. So in the Polish Hasidic movement, we're going to actually talk about this in the class next week on the Kotzker Rebbe. The Polish Hasidic movement is a history of, after the 3rd generation, from the 3rd generation on, it's a history of conflict and splits and breaks and very painful stories between master and disciple, between friends. And a period of great creativity was accompanied by tremendous conflict. This absolutely happened, and it happens even today. Just recently, I read an article about a controversy over succession in a Hasidic community now. It happened this past year. So it certainly happens, and 2 Jews, 3 opinions is an understatement. We like to disagree. We disagree with ourselves if there's someone else even better. And we often get into conflicts and controversies. And that's why I think it's really important to take a step back and think carefully about how do we develop norms for conflict and norms for disagreement and for constructive conflict, so that we can continue to harness the power of a Reish Lakish who's going to challenge us with 24 questions, but make sure that it never devolves into the kind of ad hominem hurtful attack that is destructive that we read in the story. So the short answer is yes, this happens in the Hasidic world. It happens in every part of the Jewish world at some point.
Does it happen in the Buddhist world? That's another discussion, I guess.
Actually, I used to think that it didn't, but it absolutely does. It depends which part of the Buddhist world you're talking about, but absolutely. Human beings are, we're not conflict averse by nature. Some of us as people are, but that doesn't mean we don't have conflicts. It just means we manage them differently. And the only I think difference is that in Judaism we have a tradition of argumentation. Buddhism also does, actually, in certain traditions of Buddhism, textual interpretation and arguments. But for the most part, we have a very overdeveloped tradition of argumentation and precise reading and caring a lot about how we interpret sacred texts and also the world. So we've developed that capacity over many generations to a very extreme degree. And when we use that in positive ways, it's unbelievable. That's why we have great Jewish scientists who are very precise and careful in their work. And we have great Jewish thought leaders in many different fields. It's an incredible strength. When it gets personal, or we forget that we're really working towards the same ultimate goals, then it can get really destructive.
It seems we'll end on on this final point that Sarah keeps asking in different ways. So I'll try to phrase it hopefully correctly. But it seems like the story gives you two alternative ways to learn from someone. One, agreeing all the time. One, attacking all the time or finding the holes. Are we really looking for a middle ground where you support someone, but you also nicely show them where the holes are so that you don't get to the point where we get to in the story? The question that ties into the relationship in a marriage, which the Esposito brings up, which should be in many ways different maybe than a student and a teacher relationship. And then it goes to the issue of Ezer Kenegdo. Sarah's really having an issue of how can you be both a helper and someone who's neged. But I do point out, you pointed out, the word is not Ezer Negdo, it's Ezer Kenegdo. And I think that's the difference. Can you comment on all of that in some very interesting way, I guess? I don't know.
Well, I disagree with everything that everyone said, and for 24 reasons. Just in case you were waiting for that. But I don't know where you're going with that last interpretation. I'd love to hear that, Ari. But I think for those who are asking about the middle ground, which is a great question, this story is presenting a kind of, Rabbi Yochanan is presenting a kind of binary archetypal thing where you're either this or that. You're either a Reish Lakish or you're a Rabbi Lazar, as you said. So for those of you who want a middle ground, you can find another Talmudic statement which says that sometimes the relationship is a relationship of Ezer, and sometimes the relationship is a relationship of Kenegdo. Sometimes the relationship is a helper. We're helpers to each other, and sometimes we are clashing. And in that Talmudic statement, it's not clear that the clashing is necessarily productive. It could be sometimes we argue, sometimes we disagree, and sometimes we align and we agree in marriage and other relationships. But I think that is pointing to a middle ground where sometimes this and sometimes that. And then the Ishbitzer Rebbe is coming to say, well, so when you agree, so there's a positive and a negative side, right? There's a pro and con to agreement. The pro is you might have more peace. You might have a sense of greater support, and that's definitely necessary sometimes. The con is, or the concern is, make sure that you're not avoiding seeing something that someone could hold up for you to see. Make sure that you're not avoiding something that's going to become an issue when you go public with your thoughts. You want people to push you on things. And when you're if you're Lincoln and you're putting together a cabinet, you want your rivals, you want your intellectual and political rivals involved because they're going to help you deepen your thinking. That's one of the things that Lincoln did very well. Other presidents have done that too. When you have a relationship that's primarily Kenegdo and there's just arguing and disagreement and pushback all the time, that can be really difficult too. So I think that the bottom line here is in personal relationships and also more broadly, we may look for a balance of those moments when we are challenging, when we are being supported, when we are supporting, when we are being challenged. We want to make sure that it's in balance and in tune. And I think a healthy, if we're bringing this to the realm of marriage and personal relationships, I think one of the simple things here and one of the simple messages of the story of Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, which is so obvious that it's shocking that it didn't happen there, is to have a conversation, a meta conversation about, well, how is this going? Do you feel like I'm challenging you too much? Or do you want more challenge? Do you feel like I'm supporting you too much and you're not learning enough? Or do you feel like that's great because you feel supported and you're challenged in other parts of your life? And to be able to communicate about these things seems sort of obvious and simple. For whatever reason, the greatest rabbis of that generation lost their ability to do that. And there was no communication about the process at all, shockingly and tragically. So I think there is a middle ground. I think the Talmud is pointing that out to us with the other statement. Sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that. But either way, there's something to watch out for. Either way, there's something to harness. There's a power, there's a positive power, and there's a potential blind spot or shadow that you have to be careful about.
Well, and another good message for where we find ourselves today in society and how we should be talking to each other, supporting, but yet challenging. Okay, I think we are out of time today. People keep posting stuff. So remember, you can always email Ariel, for at least while he's still on contract with CSP, he's going to answer you. Info at arielburger.com is Ariel's email. And I know people have been sending him emails, and I believe you have been responding because I get CC'd on them sometimes. So please feel free to email Ariel if you want to continue this discussion. Otherwise, it's late, and we kept Ariel so late. I felt so bad last night. We kept him a half an hour late. So I'm trying to keep us much better on time. So it's only 4 minutes late today, Ariel.
It was wonderful last night, too. I really enjoyed it.
Wanted to wish you a good Shabbos to you and your family. Keep safe. And we'll see you on Sunday, the doubleheader, everybody. Sunday at noon Pacific time. We're going to do our third part in our series about Elie Wiesel, and then 4 o'clock, our special member program, Yiddish Folktales, A Learning and Art Experience. See everybody on Sunday.
Take care, everyone. Stay well.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. I have to run early today. Take care.